Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good day to everyone. Welcome to Keynote session number 2. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Welcome participants. My name is Luis, and I will be the Zoom call host for this session. After all the keynote presentations, there will be 4 discussants, and we will be introducing them afterwards. Thank you. So without further ado, I will be introducing our keynote session chair.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Large. I'm very pleased and privileged to have been asked to chair this session. My main presence, of course, will be to stay in the background and just to try and guide the session through to the conclusion and to provide maximum chance and visibility for our keynote speakers and also to our discussions today. We're delighted to have a number of very high-profile speakers with us today. We have Dr. Shailesh Nayak with us today. We have Ms. Navi today, and we'll be introducing each of these as we come with a slide, just like the one you see on the screen, so you'll be able to see the achievements and the profiles of our speakers as they come up. And finally, we've got Professor Salim Al-Hook as well joining us today. And also 4 of my colleagues who are working with me on a current project called Living Deltas, a major research hub working in the region on delta resilience. We have Dr. Hui Lee from Vietnam, Professor Tuhun Ghosh from India, Dr. Faisal Rahman, based currently in the UK, and Professor Fabrice Renaud, also based in the UK. So again, these discussants will be taking over after the speakers and helping to sort of respond to some of the points raised and then to generate discussion. And I hope that all of you here present in the session have the as you wish, can pose questions in the chat, and we can try and use those to guide some of the session. So we should have a really interesting session. As I say, my name is Andy Large. I'm a professor at Newcastle University in the UK, and I'm the director of the UKRI GCRF Global Challenges Research Fund, Living Deltas Hub. This hub is working for 5 years in 4 deltas, the GBM in both India and Bangladesh, the Ganges, Barma, Putra, Meghna system, and then in Vietnam in the Red River and in the Mekong River deltas. And we're working principally on trying to raise delta resilience through the involvement of local stakeholders. We're trying to give voices to the delta dwellers. We see this as extremely important and something that probably hasn't been to the fore so far. And it's only right, because delta dwellers themselves are at the forefront of climate change. They're going to be the first recipients of the negative impacts of some of the projections that we're sort of, the prognoses that we're seeing for deltas. The deltas are under existential threat due to sea level rise, rising climate extremes. We've seen this already in the last year and a half with 3 damaging cyclones hitting the region in the GBM where we're working with Bulbul in November 2019, Amphan in May 2020, and just more recently Yas again in May 2021. And typically over time we've seen that humanity has sort of run through a system of impact react in many ways, where there's a repeat cycle of impacts and short-term reaction. And that becomes a problem because we've got low system robustness and often long-term recovery. And if we see something like those 3 cyclones, the synergistic effects of those, their impacts before systems and people have a chance to recover, can be extremely damaging. And we know that resilience itself can't come from simply technological advances. And we know that over the last sort of 2 decades alone, the Sundarbans themselves have been hit by some over 30 damaging cyclones. And quite often that disaster management improvements have typically been iterative rather than transformational. So this is some of the challenges we see. And so that from our point of view, we're seeking to raise resilience by managing systems through ecosystem-based approaches, looking at nature-based solutions, building in natural cultural heritage, and as the buzzwords post-COVID, or as we hope post-COVID, we know we're still in the depths of it, building back better and green recovery as we begin to recover from COVID-19. So these are some of the things we're working on, and I'm really excited to see what some of our speakers will be talking about this morning. I said I'd have 5 minutes maximum. I think I'm up to my 5, and so we'll take it on from here. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker. We've had a slight change to our profile. Dr. Nayak is only able to join us for a short time. He's made a real effort to make it here because he's got another clash, and so we're delighted he was able to join us. But we've moved him to first in the session and moved Miss Navi to second. So I'll just quickly introduce our first speaker then. Dr. Shailesh Nayak, as you can see, is the director of the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru. He's Chancellor of the Terry Institute of Advanced Studies, New Delhi. He's a geologist by training, has been Secretary of the Ministry of Earth Sciences and Chair of the Earth Science System Science Organization for almost a 7-year period. And so he's been really involved in disaster management in terms of state-of-the-art warning systems and looking at marine systems in particular during his tenure in ESO. He's a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences and a whole range of other honors, which I could run through, but I'd probably embarrass him and we'd take away from our discussion time. So I'm sure you can read those there. We're delighted to have the director of the National Institute of Advanced Studies to talk to us today, and so it's my honor to pass over to Dr. Nayak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy, for very generous introduction. And I'm also grateful to Dr. Pal and the organizers for inviting me for this very important discussion. I will quickly try to say a few things about the natural hazard, how we have to address in general, but mostly this also very well, because the area which I'm going to talk is all deltaic area. So it's also pertains to delta per se. Today, if you see, we have two major challenges. One is natural hazards and other the possible impacts of the climate change while we want to reach to the sustainable development. Most places on Earth are vulnerable to one or other hazards, maybe floods, droughts, earthquakes, cyclones, storms, tsunami, landslides. So, but we have to live with these hazards and we have to prepare ourselves to respond to hazards in such a way that we can save lives as much as possible. The natural hazards basically represents the extreme fluctuations in the average dynamic state of the Earth system. The effective response to such a system could be based on the quality of the scientific knowledge about a particular hazard, expertise of the organizations who are responsible to respond to such extreme events, and the hazard consciousness of the local communities. The extreme or hazardous events, when it interacts with the vulnerable human and natural systems, it can lead to disasters, especially in absence of responsive social and human systems. Hence, the building of effective resilience has to be addressed at the 3 levels. One is a global or earth system of scientific knowledge, the social system, which comprises of the governance structure, infrastructure, industrial capability, and the human system or the consciousness of the people to a particular hazard. Now, first let us look at the earth system where we stand. The knowledge about the earth system is very critical to build the effective mechanism for an accurate detection and monitoring of hazard, early forecast, and setting of the warning services, and constant assessment of hazard and vulnerability of the people. The basic knowledge elements include the physics of hazard generation, their space and time history, and the details of the Earth processes which are responsible. The global observation, including satellite and aircraft observations of atmosphere, ocean, land surface, which are normally need to be processed in a real time, are required for these predictions models. And because of the satellites, we have today capability to see the Earth system at a very temporal, spectral, spatial resolutions. And also with the advent of GIS, we can assimilate or integrate all the data from different platforms and organize into a database, analyze and the model, and we can also visualize various processes and convey our advisories through web and location-based services. So we have very extremely powerful technologies now, which has made possible quite difference in how we respond to the hazards. Last 2 decades, we have made significant progress in all forecasting capabilities. However, not all the hazards we have been able to forecast yet today. I'll give you a few examples where we stand. The cyclone is one of the major hazards in this part of the world, and which threatens the human lives, livestock, also damages the agriculture, infrastructure, and many other things. The forecast of cyclones have been now quite reliable, as we have witnessed in last decade, and many lives we have been able to save. If you recall, in '99 in India, about 10,000 people died from the cyclone which hit one of the Orissa, which is on the eastern part of the India. Now, this was possible because a lot of investment in the observations of both ocean and atmosphere through satellites and in situ systems, the weather radars, automatic weather stations, and many other such systems, we are able to understand the conditions of generation of cyclones much better. And this, with the advent of our computing technology and assimilation technology, we have been able to run the Mesoscale model at 3 kilometers and the global models at 12 kilometers, which has improved quite a bit. And you can see in last decade or so, the lives lost from the cyclones has dramatically reduced. The second major hazard which we need to discuss is about tsunami. And the 2004 tsunami affected the entire Southeast Asia, and lakhs of people died because there was no warning system. The warning system came in October 2007, which is a very classic case of how the decision support system should be built. And this system is capable of receiving and analyzing seismic and sea level data, both from the coast and deep sea, all from global stations in real time. And also it provides the advisories about travel time, run-up height at 1,800 coastal forecast point all along the Indian Ocean. Now this has helped quite a bit because the information comes within the 10 minutes of earthquake occurring anywhere else. And this provided some kind of resilience to the tsunami. However, we have been able to do only far-field tsunamis. The near-field tsunamis are still a challenge, and we need to address this issue, that how we can understand this near-field tsunami and how fast we can give the advisories to local communities. We have seen in Indonesia, because of the near-field tsunami, still lost lives in spite of having a warning system. The third major issue is of the floods, and floods not on the plains, but in the cities, in the coastal cities, especially on the East Coast. We have seen a severe flooding events, one in 2015 in Chennai, and also in the other coastal cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, and many others. Now this requires integration of a regional weather models, the tide models, the overrun flow, hydrology and hydrodynamic models. And then we should be able to provide how the inundation is likely to take place locally into each city. In India, we call a ward which is a small area, about a hectare or so. So we should be able to provide this kind of inundation details in real time so that we can save lives and the property. So this kind of a system is also now in place. The fourth area which we don't have much handle is the earthquake. We are still unable to predict earthquakes and it causes tremendous damage to properties and lives. In this, we can do only three major things which we need to do to build some kind of a resilience. The one is the monitoring system of earthquake should be very efficient. The second, we should have a maps of a microzonation. That means the areas which are vulnerable to different earthquakes should be very clearly defined, especially in all urban settlements. And there are a lot of work we need to do about understanding the precursors. There are many precursors. I won't go into the details, but what is the relationship between the precursors and earthquake generation processes? This needs to be further strengthened, and this is what we need to do in coming time. There is another area which is a triggered earthquakes, and this is many areas are now suffering because of the triggered earthquakes, because of the anthropogenic activities, especially oil wells or a reservoir. And this is something which is very important because it generates a lot of fear and panic into the local communities. And there's a very experiment in India where we have been able to drill a borehole. That means wherever the earthquake is occurring is a very shallow, about 4 to 7 kilometers. You drill a borehole, put all the measurements, and try to understand how the physical and chemical aspects are changing before, during, and after the earthquake. So this experiment is now, the pilot phase is just now over, and the main borehole will be drilled. And probably first time, we would be able to observe what happens during the earthquake. There are many attempts have been made elsewhere all the world, but till today we have not been able to observe this. I think we would be able to observe this. There are many other hazards, but I won't go into the details. But few things I would like to say, that these are our capability to understand the hazard, and forecasting should be our ultimate goal, and we should strive toward that. But that's not the only thing. The next important thing is how good the response mechanism we which have. Now, we have seen that the good capacity to forecast is not sufficient to meet risk. We have seen in many countries that the cyclone warning is available. However, we still lose a lot of lives. So the existing system or a social system, which could be political, administrative, economic, as well as the industrial structures, are also equally important to provide resilience to the society. And we have seen that though the hazard-related information has been provided, in absence of any effective communication to people at large, or lack of ability of local administration to respond to such an event, still causes loss of lives and damage to the property. So in India, the setting of a national disaster management authorities, both at the federal and the state level, as well as the National Disaster Response Force, has tremendously improved the response mechanism. And this system has developed the information system and the emergency plans for evacuation, rescue, and relief, which helped us to set up very effective and efficient response mechanism in the country. I think this is one thing which is very, very critical, and this system should periodically conduct mock drills and the communication tests, which are very critical, so that we know that how the system is in functioning. The next thing is that even if you have the forecasting and the response mechanism, the supportive human system is very critical. We have seen on the East Coast in India that the trust of the local communities in the forecast, as well as their confidence in the local administration, is equally important. Unless you have this, both the trust of the local communities, we still find that lives could be lost. And this can be achieved by providing necessary awareness about the particular hazard. And one thing which we have been doing is identifying a volunteer in each village who would be able to convince and inform the local population about the impending danger and what likely to be done. In conclusion, I would like to say that we need to consider how our anthropogenic activities have influenced the hazard generating processes. The changing climate, we have seen that leads to changes in the frequency, intensity, spatial extent, duration, and timing of the extreme weather and climate events. The recent IPCC report also emphasizes that the likely increase of extreme weather and rainfall events in South and Southeast Asia. Though it is difficult to relate the individual event to climate change, but we are experiencing increasing events of heavy rain and snowfalls, heat and cold waves, droughts, as well as increasing frequency or intensity of tropical storms. The rising sea level further compounds our impact on the coast. In this case, the other thing which we need to do is a very effective collaboration with the neighboring countries. So to build the observational systems, develop standards for data exchange and networking, as well as to prepare the human communities has to be ensured. So various fora which we have in this region has to be strengthened to build the response mechanism. In this, also the collaboration with the International Research Institute is very critical to address various science questions, improve our understanding between the earth-generated processes and the human interaction, and to build better predictive models. And lastly, we need to build an education system which can produce scientists and managers which are needed to implement such an approach. We need to enhance our capability for education at a regional, national, institutional, and the individual level. So, and lastly, we need to constantly evaluate and improve the performance of our forecasting system, our response mechanism, as well as the human consciousness to address newer challenges which we are likely to face. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nayak, for a comprehensive introduction to a range of aspects that I'm sure we'll touch on throughout the session. We're just sorry you can't remain with us for some of that, but I was really interested in the comprehensive way you took us through a range of disasters in terms of cyclones, tsunamis, floods, and earthquakes. That was really interesting, but also in terms of talking about beyond the actual hazards and the potential impacts of climate change, how you then illustrated the response, how that needs particularly not just capacity and expertise, but hazard consciousness within populations. I think that was key, and you took us through a range of scales, the responsibilities, I suppose, and the needs of a range of sectors of society. And I really enjoyed the way that you, as well as talking about international research, which obviously is of interest personally to me, I was really interested in how you then mentioned how education was needed, to produce the next generation of scientists. I worked in Iceland many years ago, and every child there does geology, because they live on top of a geological hazard. So yeah. I think there is a need for that. I suppose my question would have been in terms of how you build that response on a local level. I think you touched on that. I just wonder if you'd like to just expand on that. We'll just we have about 5 minutes for questions for each speaker as we go, and then we can return to those later. But I just wondered if you'd like to just expand a little bit on how you sort of built that hazard consciousness. The response mechanism in terms of cyclone warning system, I think you said was something that could be held up as a classic example of real advances in efficiency. We're interested, for example, in seeing how to persuade villagers to go into cyclone shelters. You need, for example, to create space for their livestock, because they won't go in otherwise without their animals and things. So small things like that. So I just wondered if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of things to do. First and foremost is the observational capability has to be enhanced, in the sense that many times we have seen like earthquake, we are not able to predict because we are unable to observe what is happening below the ground. So we need to have more dense observations, more frequent observations. And the second thing which is very critical is the how you use these observations. And many times, you know, you build capability in the near real time. If you get the information after a few days or few hours, may not. So that communication between the observation and your data analytics, whatever you want to do, there has to be a near real time availability of the information. And the second thing is that humanly it is many times not possible. So you need to build automatic procedures by which the observations are collected, processed, and analyzed, and then the expert comes into picture only when the final advisories are to go out. So a lot of automation has to be built in, which is of course criteria based into this. And this, again, this information should go to a right person, to a person who can respond in time. And many times this question comes because today you can also inform all the people directly through mobile and all that. But I want to advocate that because they don't know what to do. The main problem is, even if you know the disaster hazard is coming, what to do and where to go. So it is better that the local person in the village, one person which I was saying, he knows what to be done in case of that. So he can take those people to a safe place. And there could be a maps. We have produced a 3-dimensional maps, which says that which is the safest place in that particular village or in that particular area. So this is very critical. And lastly, which you also stressed, is the consciousness of the people. And this comes only by practice, in the sense, if you keep on giving a forecast and most of the time, if you are wrong, they are not going to believe you. So whatever education or whatever you may do to them. So we have to build that trust, and that trust comes with the constant interaction with these local communities. And that is where the local volunteer comes into picture, because the scientists or who are designing system may not be able to interact with directly. So we need a person who is well versed in understanding this and able to communicate. So I think this is the whole system which has to be built if we want to provide resilience for the disasters.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Nayak. And the emphasis on trust, I think, at the end was something very important and something that we need to build. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
I'm only sorry you can't join us for the rest of the session, but
I'm also really sorry.
You've set us up really well.
Yeah, we'll catch up some other time. Thank you.
Absolutely, lovely to meet you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on now, and our next speaker is Hapnavi. Ms. Hapnavi is chair of the SummerNet Steering Committee, and she's currently the Deputy Director of the Inland Fisheries and Development Institute, which is part of the Fisheries Administration in the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. She's works in a number of projects, principally as a socioeconomist and working on social development, and importantly on gender and livelihoods, which was really important. And so therefore, very much welcome, Ms. Navi, and we're delighted to have you and honoured to have you here with us today. And I'll just pass over to you now, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me this The great pleasure to deliver this keynote in this panel discussion. Okay, Professor Andy Ladd, distinguished panel members, participants, a very good afternoon from Cambodia. It gives me a great pleasure to deliver this keynote in this panel discussion. Yes, as you already introduced me, yes, I no need to do my introduction by myself. So the SUMANET is a regional research network in the Mekong region that aims to influence development policy and practice for better sustainability through research, capacity development, and policy engagement. We have about 350 network members representing various research organizations, policy makers, NGOs, and the media. SUMANET was established in 2005 and has largely been supported by the Swedish government through the Swedish International Development Agency. As I am the presently the Deputy Director of Industry Research and Development Institute under Fishery Administration or Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fishery in Cambodia. In this role, I engage with water resource actively. I have done many research projects on the socio-economic of small-scale fishery and aquaculture in Cambodia, and the economic value of wetland ecosystem and resources in the lower Mekong Basin. I have also conducted a number of the study on transboundary fish trade in the Mekong Delta. Next slide, please. You can see from this picture, for the people living in the Mekong region, fish is the source of food income and providing job opportunity or livelihood activity to millions of people living along and far from the river or water body. It is estimated that around 30 million people living and working within 15 kilometers of the Mekong. In Cambodia, according to Mekong River Commission, fishery contribute to 18% of national GDP, and this is more than the contribution from rice production. Fish also provides more than 70% of protein intake of the Cambodian population. There is so many data showing the importance of fishery sector to the lower Mekong Basin. With these challenges faced by our region today, specifically in the Mekong Delta, due to many development and climate change impacts, the fishery sector is also greatly affected. This includes the impact felt by individuals, families, and communities who living depend on the fishery value chain. I especially would like to highlight the role of women and small-scale fishery. Go to next slide, please. Women play a critical role in every link of the value chain in small-scale fishery. Those mostly they are women. They are known for the role in marketing, processing fish, and other products from fishery resource. The gender-based division of labor in fishery, with men fishing and women processing fish, cause us to think that women only play marginal role in fishery. This has caused us to overlook important contribution of women in the fishery value chain and result in their marginalization in fishery management and policy decision making. Women are sidelined and their voice are not heard. Simply, they do not matter about this. Go to next slide. Next slide, please. Likewise, for the small-scale fishery, although it provides significant source of food, employment, and income, small-scale fisheries are mostly overlooked by existing land and policy in the developing country and missing within the discussion relating to poverty reduction strategies at the national level. Why don't we overlook the important contribution from both women and small-scale fishery in the fishery sector? I think the answer mainly lies in our fail mainly lie in our failure to understand the value of women's and small-scale fishery contribution to economic growth of developing countries. Something needs to be done to address this. In a study by FAO, it was found that there are various means by which women access fish. First, as primary user when they catch the fish by themselves, or when they finance fishery operations. Secondly, as secondary user when they access fish through personal relationships. Finally, as tertiary user when they buy fish directly from fisher or trader. The various role of women show how potentially effective their voice can be in shaping the decision making, whether at the level of the community, village, fishery, or even in delta region. In the case of small-scale fishery, they are proven to be important to poverty alleviation, food security, and rural development. In my country, Cambodia, the fishery law classifies fishery into three types of fishing activity, including small-scale or family fishery, the second middle-scale fishery, and large-scale or commercial fishery. Small-scale fishery operating as community fishery are the main fishery activity in Cambodia. However, numerous family-scale fishers are not registered as a member of community fishery. These community fisheries are the main source of fish, which is an important part of our diet. Fish is so important to us that the the vast delight in bowl of beyond wall in the Angkor Wat temple. The real has been named after the fish that it is the key ingredient of a Cambodia delicacy we call the fish paste, and in Cambodian language we call prahok. This fish species, the fish species that we use for do this product is trai we call trai. And according to FAO, Cambodians are among the largest consumers of freshwater fish in the world, with annual per capita fish consumption of ranged from 41 to 60 kilograms, representing 70% of Cambodia's intake of animal protein. This again shows how important small-scale fishers are in the fishery value chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we increase the recognition of women and small-scale fishers in the context of decision making, especially in the context of Asian mega delta? May I remind everyone that 30% of the Mekong Delta is in Cambodia. The upper part of the Mekong Delta is Cambodia's tertiary territory. Thus, Khmer has a stake and a role to play in the resilience and well-being of the Mekong Delta in the same manner that the Delta have been an important source of fish and livelihood for us. The same study by FAO mentioned how women participants can be improved by raising awareness of gender equality along the value chain by applying a gender lens, by providing appropriate support to women organizations, including formal recognition of their professional activity, by understanding the socioeconomic context and the particular needs of small-scale fishers, small-scale fishery by giving more attention to power and power relationships and by taking greater account of the contribution of women in fisheries. I would like to share a good example from Cambodia, where women have meaningful participation in community fishery. The involvement of women in community fishery, where about 45% of members are women, have given them a formal status and voice in decision making. They have played a key role in promoting conservation action, long-term education development, the dissemination of information, and presenting arguments against illegal fishing activities. So this shows that it is possible in face a mass that we recognize the role of women and small-scale fisheries so that we implement development policy and practices that enhance sustainability while supporting economic growth that are not only sustainable but much more importantly equitable. Next slide, please. So in 2 minutes, like you can see in this photo, in 2 minutes we have continuously encouraged and supported researchers to look at the role of women and small-scale fishery in the delta decision making. We also support our researchers to communicate their research findings to the policy stakeholders and use these findings to engage with them. We also build a network of early career female researchers who will generate predictable knowledge that reflect the aspirations of people in the Mekong region. Under the current phase of SuperNet, call it SuperNet for all, our network contributes to addressing water insecurity for all in a manner that ensures gender and social equality, respect human rights, and mitigate conflicts. We do this through supporting policy relevant research projects. We also encourage and support our researchers to engage with policy stakeholders through their projects, ideally as early as the conception of research ideas. By doing this, we hope that our research will have meaningful impact on policy and practice. To enable our researchers to produce credible knowledge and conduct effective policy engagement, SuperNet provides capacity building and mentoring support for our researchers and partners using the expertise within the network. Dr. Hui, who will speak in this panel, in playing a key role in Sumanet as our gender advisor. Contributing to sustainability in the Mekong Delta, our researchers have implemented numerous research projects since the establishment of our network. We know that there still are being challenged in the Delta, so that we are still committed to pay special attention to its long-term welfare. We continue to support research that will generate policy recommendations for stakeholders in the Mekong Delta to address pressing challenges. You can see from this slide, in fact, there are upcoming opportunities from Sumanet for all researchers and practitioners in the Mekong as we are launching 3 competitive calls, like in which one of them is Rapid Response Research Grant Call. The Rapid Response Research Grant will support research which will provide evidence that directly contributes to ongoing planning or decision-making process at national or regional level, which address challenges being faced and help reduce water insecurity. So, if any of researchers and practitioners here would like to address the challenges we face in the Mekong Delta, I am keen to invite their participation to this grant call, which will be issued very soon. Please connect and engage with Sumanet by visiting our website, like shown on the screen, and following us at social media for regular updates and detailed information about our grant. If you like to engage more with our network, I would like to invite you who are focusing on the Mekong region to join our network. So
Thank you very
finally,
much.
the last slide. Finally, I would like to wish this panel a fruitful discussion, and I am looking forward to interesting insights coming out from our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Navi. That was a very powerful presentation. Lovely images. I mean, we were just drinking in the images that you were showing that were beautiful, and some of the facts that you were just telling us. I mean, I think we'd better move on without questions now, but I hope people will think about putting some questions in the chat so that we can have some questions at the end once we've had our discussions. There's a question here about agenda, for example, in disaster risk management, I suppose, in the fishery sector. I suppose we could have that one very quickly. If you could just give maybe a minute-long answer to that. We'd like to make enough space for all the speakers and time for presentation. We can address that one, or if you'd like to just wait until later on and think about that one, it's up to you. Do you want to take it now or later on? The question is, how should gender be considered in disaster risk management in the fishery sector? I think what we'll do, in the interest of time, we'll move on, given we had some technical issues there, just held us back a little bit. So we'll move on to our next speaker now, and then we'll keep that question, and we'll make sure that we ask it very much. We'll put that one very first at the very beginning. So we'll move on to our third keynote speaker, who is well known to me because Professor Salim Hook is also on the advisory board of our Living Deltas Hub. So I'm delighted to welcome Salim here today. He's the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, or ICAD, and also professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh, as well as being associate of the IIED, the International Institute on Environment and Development in the United Kingdom. He's also chair on the expert advisory group for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, but also importantly for this session, a senior advisor on a locally led adaptation with the Global Center on Adaptation based in the Netherlands. And so we're keen to sort of consider in this session also how in terms of delta resilience and resilience to disasters that we see affecting many of our parts, our landscapes in the region, how locally led adaptation can be part of this. And as part of this, Salim organizes an annual conference, Gobeshona, which this year held its first online version, Gobeshona Global 1. And we look forward to that running as an annual session from now on. Salim was recognized as one of the top 20 global influencers on climate change policy in 2019. So we're honored to have him today and to listen to his inputs on disaster resilience and sustainable development with potentially, I don't want to lead this conversation, but a mention on locally led adaptation. So welcome, Salim, and we're very pleased to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andy, and good afternoon to everybody. Apologies for a bit of a sore throat, so I may have a bit of difficulty talking. I have a PowerPoint presentation which my colleague is going to run for me. It has too many slides for me to go through in detail, so I'll sort of rush through them and give you a few of the highlights. And then we can share the PowerPoint with you if you want to share it with the participants. What I will do is give you a sort of overview connecting disaster risk reduction in the Asia-Pacific region with climate change adaptation and a little bit of a flavor of what it means in the context of Bangladesh, my country, where I'm based, and also a bit, as you said, on locally led adaptation, working with the most vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. Now, let me start with a little bit of the climate change science domain, where I'm sure people are familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I refer here to a special report on 1.5 degrees that they produced in 2018, which basically made the point that 1.5 degrees is a critical threshold that we don't want to cross if we want to protect ecosystems and human beings on planet Earth from the adverse impacts of climate change. It was adopted in the Paris Agreement as a goal. We're not reaching it yet, but we are still hoping that we can raise ambition to reach that goal. So 1.5 degrees, iconic temperature goal to keep in mind coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Next slide. At the global level, as you know, climate change is a global problem. It is going to impact everywhere eventually, but some places before others. And you can see on this map, the darker the color, the bigger the impact, or the more near term the impact. And Asia is the darkest continent of all, particularly South Asia, where I am located right now in Bangladesh. So particularly relevant for those of us in the Asia Pacific region. Next slide. I'm now going to link the climate change arena with the disaster risk reduction. As you know, those of you who work on DRR will be familiar with the Sendai framework. That is a parallel set of global discussions and goals. And under that, you can see in this slide, the increasing number of hydrometeorological related disasters that we are seeing over time. And this is definitely a harbinger of things to come with global climate change and increased global temperature. Next slide, please. This particular slide is often called the burning embers slide. It's an iconic IPCC slide where the darker the color is, the greater the impact, negative impact. The lighter the color, the less the negative impact for different ecosystems. And you can see even at 1 degrees, a number of ecosystems, particularly coral reefs, are particularly sensitive. And you may know that, may have seen in the news, controversy going on between UNESCO and Australia about putting the Great Barrier Reef in Australia into a endangered list, which UNESCO says it must be, and the Australian government is disputing. But I think the science is very strong there. But at 1.5 degrees, you'll see almost all the other ecosystems also get affected. And at 2 degrees, everybody is badly affected. So we definitely want to avoid getting to 2 degrees and preferably staying below 1.5 degrees. The good news is we've agreed to do that. The bad news is we're not doing it. So we need to do more to get there. Next slide. So now let me link a little bit the realm of disaster risk reduction with the realm of climate change adaptation. And there's no fixed line between the two. There's a sort of fuzzy line from DRR to CCA. And the big difference, I would say, is that climate change adaptation has a longer term dimension to disaster risk reduction or disaster management. Disaster management tends to come in after the disaster, help people, and then move on and help them get back to where they were before. Whereas with climate change adaptation, we need to be thinking about future impacts and being prepared for them. So we often talk about building back better rather than building back to the same level that we were before. And so for those of you working in the disaster risk reduction arena, it's very, very important for you to understand the potential impacts of climate change and incorporate climate change adaptation into your longer term investments and plans going forward. And it's not very different, but it is a little bit different in terms of the timeline. Also slightly different in terms of the kinds of impacts. So traditionally recognized impacts like floods and cyclones and typhoons and droughts, these are all well known. But slow impacts like sea level rise, for example, is a sort of is a slow emergency. It's not something we've seen before. Salinity intrusion into low-lying coastal areas, etc. Something we now need to be thinking about in the context of climate change, which we didn't need to think about in the context of disaster risk reduction only. Next slide, please. So in the climate change arena, we often talk about the issue of vulnerability. So that's what we start with. We map the vulnerability of different groups, different countries, different regions within countries. And then the intention of the interventions are to reduce vulnerability. On the other hand, we also talk about resilience, which is sort of the opposite side of the coin, where we want to enhance resilience. So the interventions on building adaptive capacity or doing adaptation or coping capacity is to reduce vulnerability of the vulnerable communities and countries and enhance their resilience. So you will often in the climate change arena come across the pairing of the phrase adaptation and resilience. It's a very common phraseology that we use. Next slide, please. Let me now move on to a little bit about disaster climate change vulnerability in my country, Bangladesh, where we are a disaster-prone country for, ever since we existed because of our geography and location. But at the same time, we're also very climate vulnerable and sensitive, and we have been doing a lot about that. So I'll share a little bit. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the vulnerable areas. The yellow in the southern portion at the bottom is the coastal area where we are seeing traditionally impacts of cyclones. It's a cyclone-prone country, but also now more increasingly intrusion of salinity, saline water coming in because of sea level rise. This is something new that's happening because of climate change that didn't happen before climate change. Then if you look at the blue areas above that, you'll see that they quite a large area clustering around three major rivers, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna, all of which have big floodplains that get flooded regularly during the monsoon season. This is nothing new. It's not flooding is not due to climate change, but the frequency of big floods has definitely changed because of climate change. So what used to be a 1 in 20 year severe flood has now become, in the last 20 years, we've had 4 of them, if not 5 of them. And so what used to be a 1 in 20 year big flood is now probably more likely a 1 in 5 year big flood. And then the pink bits on the northwestern side is a drought-prone area called the Brarind, where during the dry season we don't have much water. Not desert-like conditions, but for relative to our conditions in Bangladesh, lack of water for part of the year. Next slide. The biggest impact that we have all over the country, as you saw in the previous map, is flooding. The major rivers, the cities like Chittagong and Dhaka. We have various kinds of floods. We have flash floods, we have coastal floods, and these are increasing in magnitude, if not number, going forward because of climate change. And we have to deal with that. Next slide, please. Another big impact is cyclones. Again, cyclones are not new, they are not man-made, but their intensity is going to increase because of human-induced climate change. And this particular photograph is of Cyclone Amphan, which hit us in May of last year. And while it was in the Bay of Bengal, where you can see very deep red colors, it became a super cyclone because the sea surface temperature was about 2 degrees centigrade elevated above normal and gave the energy to the cyclone. The cyclone's energy comes from the temperature of the sea, and the higher the temperature, the bigger the cyclone impacts are. And that caused quite a lot of damage, both to India as well as Bangladesh that year. Next slide, please. So this slide, which I won't go through in detail, sort of illustrates the different kinds of populations that are at risk, whether they, depending on where they're located, if they're in the low-lying coastal area or in cities or mountains. Geography is very important. But then another factor is the socioeconomic conditions of the people. And a very generalizable truism, which is true for all countries, whether they be rich or poor countries, is that poor people in any country are generally more vulnerable than rich people. Not only because they have less money, but because they tend to be living in more hazardous places where the rich don't live. And so poor people are amongst those most vulnerable. And then if you disaggregate amongst the poor, women more than men, children more than adults, elderly more than normal adults, etc. So there's a whole hierarchy of greater vulnerability that we need to take into account if we want to do something to help those who are being affected by the impacts of climate change. Next slide. So I'm coming towards the end of my talk, where I'm going to link climate change with development. As you know, the countries in this region, we all need to develop. That's an imperative. But we need to be developing with climate change in mind so that we can develop in a manner that is resilient to the impacts of climate change. And on the development arena, we have agreed 17 sustainable development goals, one of which, SDG 13, is actually on climate change. So climate change is part of the 17, and it links up with many of the other SDGs as well. Practically every single SDG needs to take climate change into account. Next slide, please. In the climate change arena itself, we have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that has been universally agreed by all countries. And under that, we had a major breakthrough a few years ago in Paris, France, at the 21st Conference of Parties in 2015, where we agreed the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This is now something that all countries have agreed to implement. The United States under President Trump had withdrawn for a few years, but that is fortunately now over. President Biden, as soon as he came into the White House, rejoined the the Paris Agreement. So it's now a universal agreement that all countries have agreed to abide by. So that's a very good news on the climate change front in terms of getting an agreement in place. The bad news is we still haven't achieved what we agreed to do. Next slide, please. So basically, in the climate change sphere, we talk about two aspects of climate change. The first one being mitigation, which is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For those of you who work in the disaster risk reduction world, you may use the word mitigation slightly differently from those of us who use it in the climate change world. In the climate change world, it's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In the disaster risk reduction world, it's often used as a means of reducing the hazard of disasters. They have very different meanings, the same term, mitigation, whether we are talking in a climate change context or a disaster context. But nevertheless, in the climate change arena, has clear meaning, and it's basically to do with energy use, with the burning of fossil fuels like coal and gas and petroleum, etc. And on the other side, we have adaptation, which is dealing with the adverse impacts of climate change, very often in agriculture or in water resource management or in coastal zone management. And then there's a little bit of overlap between the two, mainly in terms of land use and forestry, because if you plant trees, then those are mitigation, they sequester carbon dioxide, and they can also help with adaptation. So there are some win-win strategies that allow both adaptation and mitigation to take place together. Next slide, please. I'll say a little bit about the issue of adaptation, which is what I work on most of the time. We have sort of different phases of adaptation. One being incremental adaptation. How do we just build up more resilient infrastructure, more resilient crops and cropping patterns and agriculture? And then we also have locally led adaptation, which is my area of work, particularly working with the most vulnerable communities and enabling them to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, learn about the impacts, and then adapt to those impacts. And then in the somewhat longer term and more on an aspirational basis, nowadays we're talking about transformational adaptation, which is beyond simply dealing with the risk, but overcoming the risk and coming out better off on the other side. Still something that's aspirational and being studied and not being achieved by anybody that I know of, but something that we hope to be able to move towards going forward. Next slide, please. Let me just share a little bit about what we're doing here in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. In Bangladesh, we have been aware of the climate change problem, and as I said, we have been a disaster-prone country for centuries, if not decades. And so we are well aware of disaster risk reduction. We have probably the best cyclone warning system in the whole world, and also a lot of planning on different aspects of development, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. These are just a few examples of national plans that have been developed, which I won't go into the details of, but just to say that we are well aware of the issue. We have been doing a lot of planning to deal with it. I won't claim that we've been very successful in implementing those plans, but we are trying our best to go up a learning curve in terms of following through on the plans and implementing and learning as we do. So it's a very much a learning by doing process going forward. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates a little bit of what we have been doing over time in the realm of adaptation to climate change. The first panel row at the top looks at what is happening at the global level in terms of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, national adaptation plans, etc. The middle panel is in green is the national planning system in Bangladesh, which I just described. We have a number of different plans. And then the bottom panel is over time showing the many, many different activities that are taking place in Bangladesh, both by the government as well as non-governmental actors, academics and researchers like myself, NGOs, civil society, private sector, and many, many others. So in Bangladesh, I would say we have very much of a a whole of government and indeed a whole of society approach to dealing with these issues, because it's a national issue for all of us. Next slide, please. Let me end by just sharing a little bit about the work that we do. My center, the International Center for Climate Change and Development, we are based at a university called the Independent University Bangladesh. So we run a master's program in climate change and development, also do a lot of short courses. We have a research program and publication program, and we do a lot of networking and events, both within Bangladesh as well as globally as well. Next slide, please. And we run a network of universities called the Least Developed Countries Universities Consortium on Climate Change. This is a formal consortium of the LDCs, which are 48 of the poorest, most vulnerable countries, mostly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. And finally, Andy mentioned this at the beginning, we run a big annual conference. We used to run it as a physical conference at my university. That's what the photographs are showing. But as of this year, we went virtual and we made it a global conference on locally led adaptation. And we plan to do that going forward. So the next conference will be from 22nd to 28th January next year. If anybody's interested, please feel free to get in touch, and we'd love to have you participate. Perhaps I'll stop there, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Salim, for overcoming your cough, and I hope it's not too serious and long-lasting, and wish you all the best for a quick recovery. I probably, to be fair to you, and given time is running on, I won't ask a question, but there is a quick one there. There's one in the chat. Sorry, it just disappeared. With a series of questions, but I just pose the last one to you, just a sort of quick yes or no, given your voice. Do you think the national plans are helping to strengthen locally led adaptation?
Well, they intend to. So as I said, Bangladesh is very good on intentions and plans. So yes, the answer is on paper, everything is hunky-dory. In practice, I can't make the same claim. In practice, it's still a work in progress. But the intention is there, which is good. So, you know, we don't have any pushback on this. It's just about how do we make it happen.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think to protect your voice, we'll let you rest and have a drink. We might come back with another question just at the very end. I'm sure if people want to put things in the chat, and we can always follow those on afterwards, of course. But again, just in the interest of time, and to give our discussants a little bit of space, having made the effort to come together and prepare something short and sweet for us today. We've asked 4 of our experts to come together just to give sort of like a sort of brief sort of potted sort of response or thoughts on generally locally led adaptation and the SDGs. So I'm very delighted to welcome Professor, in order of slide, Professor Tuhin Ghosh, who's Tuhin is professor and currently director of the School of Oceanographic Studies in Javadpur University in India, based in Kolkata. Tuhin's got over 2 decades of research in coastal geomorphology, disaster management, climate change impacts, adaptation strategies, and human migration. He's been India lead for a number of international research consortia on deltas. So the UK NERC funded ESPA Deltas project, for example, the Belmont Forum Deltas project, and the more recent DECMA Development and Climate Change Mitigation project. And currently he is joining us as an expert on the Living Deltas Hub. He's also been a lead author of the IPCC special report on the ocean and cryosphere and the changing climate, looking at sea level rise and implications for low-lying islands. Hui Li is a senior researcher and lecturer from VNU, the Vietnam National University, the Central Institute for Natural Resources and Environmental Studies, or CRES, based in Hanoi. Hui's research focuses on natural resource management, land tenure, and gender. And Ms. Navi mentioned that she's a gender advisor for SummerNet. Her scholarship basically looks at differentiating the effects of macro policy and how social differentiation and power relations affect the way in which different classes of people use resources and the income. And I just make a plug here for her book, which has just appeared. Springer have just published her book, Competing for Land, Mangroves and Marine Resources in Coastal Vietnam. Basically the first book-length text to deal with mangrove forests and livelihoods, and focusing on relationship between people and environment and resource stakeholders. Fabrice Renaud is Professor of Environmental Risk and Community Resilience at the University of Glasgow's School of Interdisciplinary Studies in Dumfries. So a little bit outside Glasgow, but Fabrice joined that in 2018. He's also on the Living Deltas Hub. He's the Research Director for the National Centre of Resilience, which is looking at Scotland's resilience to natural hazards. But Fabrice has a long history of working at the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security for about 11 years, and also in Jakarta for 2 years, and for over a decade was head of the Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services section of UNEHS, and has particular interest in hydrometeorological hazards and the risk assessment of social ecological systems exposed to natural hazards. And last but certainly not least, Faisal Rahman. Faisal has worked a lot with our previous speaker, Salim ul-Haq, but Faisal is working on our Living Deltas Hub. He's a postdoctoral research associate based in Durham University, soon to move to Northumbria University in Newcastle, just a few kilometers up the road. Faisal is trained in environmental engineering, works at the intersection of natural science, social science and public. Faisal's research is looking at climate change adaptation, looking at water quality, looking at vulnerabilities to environmental change, and looking at how we can enhance resilience through transdisciplinarity, collaboration, and impact monitoring. So I'm delighted to have our four discussants here today who have a sort of limited time to speak to us, but just to respond to some of the things they might have heard. But we'll start, I suppose, with in order. We'll start with Tuhin, and originally we asked you to think about the climate change related challenges for in particular to the Indian Sundarban, and what are the opportunities there for locally led adaptation, particularly in the context of the SDGs. Tuhin.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. And also my sincere regards to the eminent speakers and my friends on the dais. It's a little bit difficult to say about the climate change and impacts, all these things, because we have a lot of experts, a lot of scientists here, but everybody is blaming the climate change always. And every kind of disruption in the system, dynamic system within the Sundarban, we used to blame the climate change, but we actually forgot about the water from the upland and the sediments from the upland. It's not moving towards the delta and hindering the process of delta building. So it's there, but still we have a lot of confusing data regarding the sea level rise, which is always higher than the global mean sea level rise. And even the temperature is rising. The rainfall pattern is changing, which is really disrupting the people, especially engaged in the cultivation. And again, there are a lot of changes in the salinity in the soil and water. But at the same time, we really don't have that kind of baseline data, which can mark specially or specifically that salinity is changing. So we have our, in Living Deltas Hub, we have our ambition to build up the baseline data for the future researchers, so that they can say that, yes, salinity is changing at this point and it's not changing at this point like this. So these are the all things there, but the climate change is simply few graphs and curves for the scientists. But the climate change in reality is kind of feeling every day and experiencing every day for the community living in the delta, especially what I have observed in the Indian Sundarban and also in the Odisha Mahanadi Delta. So it's there. For example, if we just, I think there are a lot of things to say, but if we just mention the previous occurrence of cyclones, people are talking about that the cyclone is, the frequent cyclones are really produced for the climate changes. So if it is true, what the people will do? That's another. So just before the COVID lockdown, there was Bulbul 5 months before, and there was Amphan, there was Yas, frequent cyclones were there. So that kind of multiple disaster situation was there. And there was some response, which was very much short term, and the recovery or the build back better process was not really intended towards long-term solution, or the mitigation process, DRR, was absent. So people are talking about all the long-term solutions now, after all these things happen. And now they are ignoring basically the ecosystem services, the SDGs, and as such, we should aim for the development proofing, because every year, if there is such event, the development fund is getting siphoned towards the emergency fund. So it's happening, but people are not talking about that. People are not really interested about the river or Bay of Bengal water or the sediments and the hydro pressure on the embankments. Only engineering solutions they are talking about. That's a real problem, because the long-term solution should not be, or beyond to be, the engineering solutions. People are not talking about the resilient society and infrastructure. So that's a really complex system where people are really in real bad condition. They are suffering, and whereas they have started adapting. So, for example, one part of Goshaba, Kumirmari, is one of the prominent island, and almost entire 90% of the island was inundated, and they cannot really pump back the water, saline water, from the island, because the island system is like a bowl. So whenever the water, saline water, entered into the island, that is stuck, there is water logging. So what people will do, this is the cultivation time, monsoon has come, they cannot cultivate, at least for 2 years, 3 years. So what they will do? What we have observed, that people immediately try to adapt with the situation, and in the paddy field, they are growing streams and saline water fishes, and they are getting very good market value. So this is kind of indigenous traditional knowledge they are using, and they are doing all these things. I have seen in Burigwalini area of Shakira near Khulna, where people are really pumping out the shallow level of saline water, subsurface saline water, and growing streams. So it is common there. So they have learned, actually there is invisible boundary in between Bangladesh and India, but there are a lot of learning scope, which should be one of the aim of the transboundary cooperation. I think so. So there are a lot of examples. I'm not going in much detail because time is not there. But what I would say that we need to advocate for incorporating the disaster risk reduction or disaster management plans into the development planning purpose. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tuhin, and I was really nice to see. I mean, you talked there briefly about just this cocktail of one disaster after another, about money being moved from development funds to disaster response funds, etc. And then you left us with a message of hope at the end, where you talked about how the locally rooted knowledge of people was leading them to quite rapid adaptation, shifting to sort of use fisheries instead of saline affected crops, and etc. So thank you for leaving us with that sort of positive message. In the interest of time, I've been told I've just checked that we can press on to 6:10 maximum, so we'll move on quickly. Thank you, Tuhin. To Hui and Hui Li, perhaps you could just give us some inputs about the context of Vietnam.
Thanks, Andy. I would like to share with you the successes and challenges on how we localize SDGs in the context in Vietnam. Actually, in Vietnam, we don't want to use the word failure. We want to use challenges instead of failure. So I start with the national level. At the national level, we have the institutional and policy framework for implementing SDGs, and it is kind of comprehensive. We have the action plan for implementing Agenda 2030 and other strategies and policy related, while the national framework serves as the foundation for localizing SDGs at the regional level. But the role of the local government is very important. But the missing link here is that, in Vietnam, we don't have the government body at the regional level. And then we have the national, provincial, district, and commune levels, but not the regional level. And this is so difficult to localize SDGs at the Delta, or we call regional level. So in practice, localizing SDGs at the regional level is kind of formally and informally implemented by specific provincial people's committee already in both deltas, the Red River Delta and the Mekong River Delta. And we have achieved some successes as follows. That all the Delta provinces are requested to localize SDGs by their function. For example, they are requested to integrate SDGs into their local socio-economic development policy, and line provincial departments have function, mission, and resources to implement not all, but a number of SDGs under the coordination of the provincial department of planning and investment. And more importantly, the set of the SDG indicators is integrated in the set of the statistical indicators of it. So monitoring the progress of socio-economic criteria at the provincial level is at the same time monitoring the SDG related indicators. However, we have encountered challenges as well. Since the provinces implement SDGs separately, it's unlikely to succeed at the scale of the Delta. It is difficult to mobilize all the resources for implementing SDGs to create synchronous results, and lack of agency coordination mechanism for implementing SDGs at the regional level. And only 1/3 of 158 indicators are feasible in terms of methods and data. The rest don't have sufficient or lack of data. So it is of great importance to identify a common goal for the whole Delta regions to ensure that localizing SDGs achieves the expected results, and in that way we can increase resilience in the context of the Delta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hui. And that, I think there you just highlight an issue of humans in general, the way that we compartmentalize our management in many ways. We talk in our Living Deltas project about the need to manage the Sundarban as one ecosystem, and yet we know obviously over the last 7 decades or so that there's a geopolitical aspect to that in terms of a border running through that and data sharing, etc. But it's interesting to see that on a provincial level inside of one country that that the SDGs are treated differently. So that's very interesting indeed. We better move on in terms of time, but thank you very much, Hui, for your response. That was really interesting context. I'll move on next. I've lost the slide, but I think Fabrice was next, and so Fabrice has got particular interest in our hub on working on the coastal fringe, and I just wonder if Fabrice could just respond for a couple of minutes again on some of the particular issues there. Fabrice, if you're there.
Yes. Thank you very much, Andy, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. In terms of resilience-oriented coastal management strategies in tropical deltas, as the question was put to me, I think that there are, first and foremost, I'm not going to repeat the links between the hazards and climate change. This has been done by various speakers very well already. But I think that before we also consider the natural hazards, we need to try to find solutions to the pressures that we have in the delta systems themselves. And Tuhin alluded to some of them. And for example, sediment starvation through the development of infrastructure on the river system is key. Reintroducing natural flows of water within these systems is also key, particularly for preserving aquatic ecosystems. Reducing land subsidence, which is happening sometimes in some locations at much higher paces than eustatic sea level rise. You can have orders of magnitudes more land subsidence than you have eustatic sea level rise. And perhaps last but not least, reduce also sand mining in some of these systems, because this can trigger a lot of coastal erosion in the deltas. So these are not climate-related issues. These are anthropogenic issues, and we need to address them because this would already help in reducing various dimensions of the risk equation, notably the exposure and the vulnerability component, but also the hazard component of the risk equation. So that's vital in my opinion. When it comes to meteorological hazards, this then superimposes on these generated vulnerabilities and risks. And by addressing these issues again, we can reduce this risk considerably. Sometimes we need to have, therefore, basin scale approaches to address these problems. You need to really understand very well the upstream-downstream linkages within these deltaic systems. Just to give you an example, if you want to restore a mangrove on the coastline, if you do not understand the sediment dynamic, or if this sediment dynamic changes with time because of human interventions upstreams, then your restoration project is likely to fail. I think in order to address the issue of reducing risks in the coastal fringes in particular, we need to increasingly start looking at a suite of solutions and not just focus on around the world, what has been predominantly engineered solution to try to address the risk to hydrometeorological hazards, but other types of hazards. And this includes perhaps increasing our acknowledgement that nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches can play a critical role in reducing these risks. And what these ecosystem-based approaches provide is a suite of ecosystem services. So they allow you to buffer the communities against the hazards, but they will also provide ecosystem services that will allow reduction of exposure or the reduction of the vulnerability of the systems that we're looking at. And we have an increasing evidence scientifically, in terms of experts, in terms of projects that are being implemented, that this works. Now, nature-based solutions are not a panacea. They're not going to solve all the problems. The point that I'm trying to say here is that we need to really look at a series of potential solutions and pick from there the best one, the best adapted one for the problems that we're trying to answer. As a last message, perhaps, I think that in the end, what we need to develop are approaches that allow us to achieve adaptive management and avoid lock-in that we may have when we only focus on engineering solutions, so that with time, as climate change progresses, these mechanisms, these solutions can be adapted as we go and are more flexible, basically, in the long run. So I'll stop here and thank you for your attention.
Lovely, thanks, Fabrice. And I think your last point is an extremely valuable one. That the flexibility that nature-based solutions and feed into adaptive management gives us that scope for future response, I suppose. And then finally, a challenge to Faisal, just to finish off. Faisal, I think one thing that we could talk about here is it was mentioned earlier, is the need for education and the next generation of scientists. So I suppose quickly, if you can in about 2 minutes or so, therefore, how do you think youth can be more meaningfully involved in some of these approaches in locally led adaptation initiatives, and what are the opportunities and challenges for that? Big challenge for you.
Well, thank you so much, Andy, and really thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this very distinguished panel. I think I'll say the key messages that I had reserved for the end, just in the interest of time. I think the most important aspect is for us to recognize that youth is not necessarily a passive beneficiary group. Rather, we need to recognize that they're active agents who can bring change and actually can help implement SDGs. In essence, what we see is that these collectively, this particular group has more agency than any other group. So we need to be thinking around how we can really harness their skills and perspective, not in an extractive manner, but more in an inclusive manner. And to do so, I think what we have to do is we have to be innovative in engaging them. And there are different modalities. we cannot probably talk too much, but just to give you a quick example is that ICAD and the Youth Climate Lab, they're sort of implementing a project where they selected some youth associates from coastal Bangladesh, and then they trained them on how to design good adaptation projects as well as how to write good proposals. And then they funded them to implement those projects in their own community. So there is two things to look here, is that not necessarily only engaging youth means enhancing their awareness, but you also have to link them with resources and connections that they can share their ideas as well as their inputs to the right policy level. But then again, we also have to be careful when we are trying to engage them, because there are some critical questions that we need to be looking at. So for example, why are we engaging with them? Is it because they have local knowledge, or is it because of their capacity, flexible labor, or some particular professional skill set they bring in? It's very important for us to understand answering these questions, and some of these questions are being looked up by our work package 1 colleagues at the Living Deltas Hub. The other questions are that sometimes young people are considered more vulnerable than adults. Is it because that from experience, we know that when you disregard certain groups' knowledge, that can sort of lead to tokenistic inclusion of that particular group, and meaning that the factors we'll be addressing will not lead to reducing their vulnerabilities. And finally, that leads to the fact that, well, when you're trying to engage youth, policymakers need to know that, well, just the youth's local knowledge and energy should not be attractive to you, but also the agency that they bring in, which means that they have to be included in every steps of the decision-making process. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. And a brilliant sort of very concise and very powerful way to, I think, to finish our session. Youth are the future. And I've seen myself growing old, looking older and grayer on Zoom over the last 15 months. And I'm really seeing how some of the work that we're doing in Living Deltas, I'm not wanting to use this session just to advertise our work, but also around the region is really starting to galvanize this. And I think it's so key for the future. And so beyond that, a great message to end the session. We did have 5 minutes for Indrajit to sum up, but I think that really leaves us with a powerful message. I would just like to thank everybody in the session who was able to speak. So to Dr. Nayak, to Ms. Navi, and to Professor Salim Al-Hook. Thank you very much for your keynote speeches and talks. And thank you especially, I think, to Tuhin, to Hui, to Fabrice, and to Faisal for dealing with the challenge of responding in a increasingly telescoping in time, and giving us some really sort of concise and powerful messages to talk about disaster reduction and locally led adaptation. And finally, and most importantly, thank you to Indrajit and to his team for organizing this whole conference and this whole session and making it run very smoothly, apart from people like me who lets the session run 13 minutes over time. Apologies for that, but I think we learned an awful lot in that last 15 to 20 minutes to lead us forward. So thank you again to everybody who contributed, and best wishes to you all in your efforts in disaster risk reduction and working in locally led adaptation. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.